Alright, how are we doing? Yeah, let's make a start. Right, keyframes. So we're going to have a look at what keyframes are. I thought I'd start off in Photoshop again, it seemed to work quite well. Oh. What are they? I'll answer that in a minute. We're going to look at adding keyframes, we are going to look at manipulating keyframes, and we're going to have a very brief look at the dope sheet. So far we've been dealing with the timeline, which is a very basic representation of how our frames and our keyframes are working, but today we're going to get stuck into the dope sheet. And we'll have a quick look at that. Don't mind this guy, looks like he's holding a tasty hamburger. Anyway, don't mind him, I was just warming up. I don't think he'll stay around. No, I can't do that. I'm pushing my luck. Right, let's move on. So I'm going to get rid of Photoshop again. I think I will this time actually, in case I have a crash. I don't have to write those titles out again. Right, here we are in Blender once again, and we're going to talk about keyframes. Animation really is just a kind of simulation of movement. It's a series of still images to simulate movement, much like film, and we use these key points, these keyframes, to represent starting, not just represent, but to literally kind of mark out pivotal moments. So the pivotal moment in this masterpiece is this start point and then this end point here. And Blender fills in the frames in between. This is a process known as tweening, where in the olden days an actual animator would have drawn out the keyframes in the animation. So he'd have drawn out Donald Duck standing over here, then he would draw out Donald Duck standing over here, and then he'd hand it over to an apprentice or a trainee, and that dude would fill in the other 98 keyframes in between. We're in roughly frame 100. So the keyframes are the kind of pivotal points that really do tell the story. This box is going from here to here. And then the in-betweening stuff would normally be done by somebody getting paid less money. Now, the tweening normally does need a little bit of finesse. We've talked about how initially keyframes are interpolated with this kind of easing effect, where it starts off slow, speeds up, and then slows down again. So we'll talk a little bit about that later on. For now, let's just understand this point. Understand this point about keyframes, and I want you to use these kind of keyframes to block in your basic movement, and then we'll come back and finesse what's going on in between. For example, this cube goes from here to there, but perhaps we want to have him turn a corner halfway. Well, that's something we can maybe come back and tweak later on. So maybe he's going to move up to here before he comes down here, so we can move him over here and add our midpoint, and then Blender will fill in those gaps and give us that turning animation. Right, we'll come back and talk a bit more about what I'm doing here just in this dope sheet in a wee while. Let's first of all talk about adding and removing and manipulating these keyframes. So I think when we were doing our turntables and stuff, we were adding keyframes here. We were looking at the location and the rotation of our objects. And this is fine, so we can hover over. So say we'll put this back to the beginning again. We'll put our playheads in frame 0. So we'll add a location keyframe from here. So we can right click and choose insert keyframes, and that will give us a frame in the X property, the Y, and the Z, which is fine really. It starts to get a bit cluttered up later on, but we'll not worry too much about that. So that's our start point, keyframed in from the 3D properties. Let's try and do an undo. Yeah, insert keyframe. Let's go back to there. So Another way of doing the same thing would be to hit I in the 3D view. And we've got a whole load of different options we can choose from. So if we just want to keyframe, remember, much like After Effects, we are keyframing different values, different properties of the object, the property of scale, rotation, location, and then combinations of those things. We're really going to be using from here up. So we right-clicked over here. This time we'll choose I and location, and we get the same deal. We get the X, Y, and Z. It does the whole load of them. And then the idea is we move the playhead forward. So let's move it over to frame 100 and move the object to that end point of the transition I location. And there we have our masterpiece once again. We can actually, while I'm at it, let's continue on. Let's do a bit more. Let's move our guy down here, I location, and then let's actually have him when he gets to here. Oh, what have I done? When he gets to this point, let's have him rotate a little bit before as he moves on. So if we wanted to, we've been moving the location of this cube. If I now wanted to have him rotate on the x-axis and roll over, really I should have moved him up a little bit. Let's put him on a ground plane. Okay, makes sense. Roughly anyway, about there. So if we wanted him to roll over this cube, we would need a start point. Although we've got a keyframe here, which is the start point of our next transition from this location, if we wanted to then start rotating this guy, we need to add a rotation keyframe to this keying set here. So I'll just do I and choose, I've already got location, I've already got a location keyframe, so I'll just I and rotation. And then in our next frame over here, let's move it over slightly and let's do R and X and 90. That should spin at 90 degrees on the x-axis, and let's hit I. And now we have moved its location and rotated it, so now we really want a location rotation. So this inserts keyframes for that whole set of properties, well, the two sets of properties, location and rotation. So you can see now we have these here indicated in our dope sheet. So let's see, let's have a tentative. Yeah, it's not bad. It's not bad. Okay, so it's now rolled over, and we can continue moving him on his merry way. So we've got our location rotation keyframe at this point. Let's move him over here, and let's I location. Now let's make him zip up to the top. So I'm going to zoom in a bit further here. So think about bear in mind this idea of obviously the key further apart the keyframes are, the slower the transition is going to be. At 24 frames per second, you've got to work out how many frames you're going to need for a certain length of transition. So let's make them, just for a laugh, let's give them 2 frames to get to the other side of our map here. I location, and let's have a little preview of this. I'm getting almost 24 frames per second. It moves down, should get a little roll, moves across, and then zips off. So that's what we've got. Let's so that's the idea of adding a different type of keying set depending on the type of motion that you want. Let me just see that again, because I'm not going to. Yeah, that's fine. Right. Let's talk about manipulating these keyframes. So in the dope sheet, we get much more control. In the timeline, we can't do anything with these keyframes. They're kind of locked into position here. This is really just a summary of what's going on. That's how I would think of the kind of basic timeline that you get. And the dope sheet gives us a lot more control. So, for example, if I think that's going too slow, I could grab this just with G and move it in this one dimension that we had in the dope sheet over to here, for example, and then that initial transition is going to be much quicker. And this one here is going to be much slower because I've got a bigger gap here. But we can tweak that. That's the idea. If I wanted to, this is the let's have a look at this little speedy part from here to here. If I wanted to move this, we could. I could just grab these. I'm just right-clicking on this set of keyframes here, and I could hit G and grab them. Or could I, if I box select these ones, and I've got the playhead at this bit, I can scale it out from where the playhead is. You would see it scales. So just S. So most of the manipulations that you have in the 3D view work in the dope sheet. So hitting S will scale it from where the playhead is. So that's quite handy to know when you're dealing with a complex kind of set of keyframes in your dope sheet. We can use the scale option, and it will scale whatever you have selected. So that's pretty handy. We mentioned that maybe we can delete a keyframe. So if I wanted to go from here, what would be a sensible place to delete? Doesn't really matter. So let's delete. It'll go diagonally across the screen if I delete this one, but it doesn't matter. So we'll right click on these guys, X, delete keyframes. So now it's going to go from here straight across diagonally to this point and then begin its rotation. So that's really all I wanted to say about keyframes. It's going to be a case of having a play around. I want to set up something like this and have a mess around, just moving things on different axes, and just starting off with location rotation, maybe trying to animate a little bit of scale. I've got some notes here that I've not really been sticking to. Stick with me. Yes, there was one other thing I wanted to mention. If you're going to be dealing with a lot of location keyframes, for example, you can come down here to the timeline and add a keying set. So if you're going to be doing a lot of location keyframes, we can set this to location, and then every time I add a keyframe from now on, it will just give me a location keyframe. So it's successfully added 3 keyframes to the keying set location just with hitting I. I hadn't actually moved the playhead, so that was kind of a waste of time. So you've got to remember I hadn't moved the cube. So move the playhead, move them down, I, playhead, move, I, playhead, move, I, and I'm just kind of automatically keyframing its location there. Oh, I've only got 250 frames. 5,000. Okay, so that's quite handy to know. If you stop using lots of location frames, you just X that off and you can go back to your options. So, I mean, quite often you'll see people just adding by by default location, rotation and scale every time, and that's fine. That means that every frame that you add allows you to manipulate these properties, but you will start to get a really cluttered dope sheet. It's going to start getting messy if you add kind of unnecessary. So if you know that you're not going to be scaling stuff, but you might be rotating it, then maybe you want to use location rotation. But I would try and avoid location rotation and scale keyframes every time, because it's going to get messy. So I mentioned that I would go into the dope sheet a little bit. It's going to be very brief. Dope sheet, the name is a kind of hangover from traditional animation, where a physical piece of paper would be used to plan out the keyframes in an animation. So it would be a bit like a storyboard, but a lot more basic, just with symbols and letters and numbers and so on. It's just like a spreadsheet. So that's where the name comes from. It gets slightly confusing with these different, I can't remember what they're called. They're not layers, they're channels here. Why do we have so many channels? I'll try and explain that briefly. Let's just get rid of these keyframes. Let's just add a simple location keyframe. So we can roll these up. This top frame that appears, the top channel is the summary. So at a glance, if you've got these all rolled up, we can see where the keyframes are in our dope sheet. We roll this down, we'll find out we've got a keyframe on the cube, and then within the cube we have the cube action. And within that cube action is the location subset of this action, and then within that we have the properties within the subset location. So we have keyframes for Z, Y and X. You will get used to it. We have some things that we can do here. Don't worry about F-curve modifiers, but we can mute channels and we can lock them so we don't accidentally mess around with them. Is there anything else? I suppose we can briefly talk about some of these options down here. These ones here are quite handy. So this one here will show only the objects that are selected. So I'll just show you that quickly. I don't want this to go on for too long, but let's move the playhead. Let's keyframe that location and let's add what makes sense to have a sphere, I suppose. So let's put him over there. At the beginning, let's animate it, that location, and then let's get them to cross paths, bring him down here, location. So you can see that we've now got our icosphere and our cube represented in the channels here. And you can imagine when you're dealing with bones, for example, if you have rigged your character and you've got you're animating individual bones, and a bone for its arm, you want to move his arm, and then you want to move his foot, and then you want to move his head a little bit, you're going to have some crazy dope sheet action going on, right? So we can display only the selected objects. That's a really handy little button there. So if I click that, we'll only see the keyframes for our icosphere. So if you're wondering why the keyframes for your cube have disappeared, don't panic. It's probably because you switched this on at some point. This one here will include channels from objects or bones that are not visible. If you've got things that are hidden, etc. I've never really used this one. Never used that one. So Google it. But that's a really good one. We might talk about these different modes. The action editor is really helpful, and shape key editor is very helpful if you're going to be using shape keys. I'm not going to talk about this just now. This is what you use when you make animation for games, really. You're going to call up actions, so a walk action, a jump action, a crouch, etc. So that's about as much as I want to talk about just now. I will give you the task in class based on what we've been talking about here. So you may want to have a little bit of a play about with it beforehand. I'll leave that up to you. I hope that was helpful.